Hey, Faith Unfiltered podcast listeners. This is Blake Smith, project manager for Faith Unfiltered podcast. In this episode of Fair Trade, host Robin Linkhart sits down again with Gail Shurtleff. Gail first joined us for an episode of Fair Trade in 2018. Then she came back and did an episode talking about Community Circle. Now we're back for Chapter 2 of Gail's journey. The interview between Robin and Gail was so interesting and so much to cover, we've decided to break the episode down into 2 episodes. So this is part 1 of Chapter 2 of the episode between Robin and Gail. We hope you enjoy.
Hello, and welcome to Fair Trade, a Faith Unfiltered podcast series where courageous people share the candid stories of their faith journey and what brought them to Community of Christ. For this episode, we are exploring Fair Trade Chapter 2, which means we are checking in with a previous Fair Trade guest to hear what's been happening in Chapter 2 of their journey with Community of Christ. I'm your host, Robin Linkhart, and today I'm here with Gail Shurtleff. Welcome, Gail, and thank you so much for being with us today on Faith Unfiltered podcast.
Well, thank you, Robin, and hello from the lovely country of Netherlands.
It's a beautiful place. I'm envisioning it now as I look at you on our Zoom screen. Alrighty, Gail, let's take a minute to get to know you, and I want you to just introduce yourself to our listeners like you're meeting somebody for the first time with just a brief, basic, hey, about you.
Well, that's not a problem. You know my name, and I was born in the U.S. I've lived in multiple countries since I was a child. I've lived in Peru, Germany, and the Netherlands. I was an LDS seeker, and I'm now a member of Community of Christ. Professionally, I'm a licensed psychotherapist and a certified spiritual director. And I'll talk more about the spiritual direction during the podcast.
That is great. Okay, I love doing these Chapter 2 episodes. They're just so rich, and it's so exciting to hear all the things that have continued to blossom and grow in a person's life and the adventures of a faith journey. But it's really helpful to listeners to hear an overview of what we might call Chapter 1. So we're going to look to you, Gail, to kind of fill us in with that.
Okay. I want to preface this with a warning. If you are in the U.S. and you need to know, I will mention the word suicide. I am not going to talk about anything but the word and the circumstances under which I use it. If you need to, please call 988 if that word triggers you. Okay. Let's see, my hat just blew off. Can you repeat that again?
Sure, you're going to give us an overview of Chapter 1. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, Chapter 1 started in a very interesting way. My husband and I both entered a faith crisis in around 2006. He started out, and in 2008, I joined him. And all I wanted to do was support him as a husband. And so I listened. I listened to his concerns. I listened to his issues. And then it got a little more intense because I figured I needed to learn more about what he was really learning. And in 2012, not really 2011, I went down a rabbit hole and I started to learn. And at first it was just learning, and then it was wondering, and then it was questioning. And in 2013, John and I sat down in my living room with the beamer, and we watched the epic Mormon Stories interview with Steve Veazey. And I realized I could join this church. This was everything I wanted. Now, what I held back from that first podcast was that in 1995, I was standing in front of a church in Concord, California, after I'd left work. And I turned to look over my shoulder, and the church had a sign out announcing who was preaching that Sunday. And I saw a woman's name. And the Spirit said, "You need this." I'm a good Mormon girl. I shut it down. Then I stood there and I thought, well, maybe I should have taken the route to becoming oh gosh, I can't think of the word, a chaplain. And then I shut that down and I moved forward. Well, that's the beginning of the story. What I also couldn't state in that podcast, but will state now, is that in 2016, my life changed radically. I walked down the stairs to get myself something to eat, and I found the note that my husband had left telling me that he loved me, and a few more details. My life was radically altered on that August day in 2016. And that really began the journey in the community of Christ. So that's a little bit of background and context about chapter 1. Things I couldn't say in the podcast then, but I journeyed towards community of Christ knowing that there was a priesthood call. And I journeyed towards knowing that this was a path towards that.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you so much. And we really appreciate your willingness to be vulnerable and share some additional context that you could not share during your original interview. And listeners, we will put a link in the show notes so that you can listen to Gail's complete first interview with our podcast. So, Gail, we know that life transitions of any kind can be very challenging, and transitioning from one faith to another, while it can be very joy-filled and liberating for many, it's also incredibly complex and multidimensional. I mean, faith is a lifelong journey, and making a major shift along the way is part of every chapter of life thereafter. So we would love to hear your chapter 2 story of living out your faith in community of Christ.
Well, what I will also mention is part of what happened in chapter 1. In 2017, after my husband's death, I finally went to the States to see family and a friend. I also went to Sunstone in Salt Lake City, and I attended this little thing called Why I Stay. Well, Robin, you spoke at it. I wrote you a letter, and you hooked me up with people on this side of the pond. You hooked me up with Richard James and Joey Williams. And that led me into the end of chapter 1. Once I was baptized, I chose to be rebaptized and confirmed. The rebaptism had to do with what I felt I needed. The confirmation was, in a sense, a capstone, and I was on my way. I had been serving on Community Circle's leadership team since May of 2018. So I was on the team before I was even a member. And I was excited about that. Oh gosh, this brings up a lot of memories. I'm just going to tell you what I tell you now, and if other things come up, I'll add to them. We met, Circle meets online. And from very early on, I was given permission to run with things and to serve in Community of Christ. And in a sense, that was really new to me, because in my ex-faith, that would never have happened. And that was really a wide opening to where I went. Well, chapter 2 started out with listening for me. In December of 2018, after I'd been baptized and confirmed, I'd had to have an outpatient surgical procedure, but it would require me to recover for 6 weeks. I couldn't lift anything. And I'm in my laundry room, and all of a sudden, Spirit says, you're going to be called as an evangelist. You gotta understand something here. I wasn't even ordained to anything yet. I stopped. I looked at my laundry container and I said, God, I don't need to know this right now. But I did. And that began a journey into listening, but also a little bit of suppression. And what happened next was I became more involved, and I sought out an evangelist blessing. Well, I had an evangelist blessing in September of 2018. I also had a spiritual director by that time, who is part of Community of Christ. But I didn't tell her. How could I tell that? And I just started serving in Circle. I went to World Conference in 2019. And while I was there, I observed what was going around me, what was being said, what was in the tone of voice that people were using. And ironically enough, I started thinking, somebody's got to put some spiritual action into all of this. This can be done better as far as enabling people to engage in spiritual practices on a regular basis. Well, I left World Conference, went to a retreat in Italy, met Mike Botts, who is an evangelist. And I knew that whatever I was going to do, this needed an evangelist. I'll tell you, I never get in trouble for anything I do because I always do it or make the plans for it. And then I tell people what I'm going to do. And that was the way it was. I took my idea to Joey Williams, says, this is what I'm going to do. Got a problem with it? He said, no. So I connected with Mike Botts. I told him what I felt needed to happen, and then I prayed he would say yes to working with me on living spiritual practices. Well, we had to hammer out a lot of things, but by the end or beginning, I don't remember which it was now. I think it was by the end of 2019, we set to work on really doing it. And sometime in 2020 actually came to fruition. The first spiritual practice we did was one that has been seen in Community of Christ. It's called the nut that God gave us. This is totally accessible. You don't need to be able to see it. You don't need to be able to hear it. You might decide to feel it, to taste it, to explore it with all five senses and just see what's there. Mike and I have been running LSP on the first Wednesday of every month. And we've been doing it since its beginning. And it's now 2026. That's been a big part of my chapter 2. Because I just let it happen. I listened. Another part of my chapter 2 is that eventually, in spiritual direction, the Spirit told my spiritual director to sit with me until, and it took her 2 hours. And finally, I just blurted it out. I know there's a call to evangelist. And you can't run off and say anything to anybody about this. Once I had the words out, she ministered to me and she helped me get to the point where I felt strong enough and able enough to live into that call, despite its not being present. And then in 2025, during a session, I said, if this doesn't happen, I think God is going to force me to bang down somebody's door in 2026. because it was so strong and so powerful. And it was as if the Spirit was saying, you cannot be held back. Well, the end of 2025 came. I didn't bang down a door, because in March of 2025, I was asked to attend a meeting. And when I saw who was on that Zoom call, I said, oh my gosh, I'm busted. And Richard extended the call. And I told him I'd respond, but yes, my answer would be yes. There have been small things in chapter 2 so far. Community Circle was not an official congregation in 2018. Well, actually 2017, when we held our first meeting, of which there were only 4 people present. And by the end of 2018, I knew Circle needed to be an officially recognized congregation. I started working on that. And we did get things going. And it did come to pass. And we organized. We're now an emerging congregation, and we're moving forward. That was exciting. And that added to, wow, this is something I could have never done in that other place. Yet I could listen and get the guidance that I needed in Community of Christ. Another highlight of my early chapter 2 is that the call to elder was extended. And when it happened, when they told me they wanted to meet with me, it was Joey and Rand. I thought, here it comes. Before I entered that Zoom meeting, I said a prayer. I said, please get it right. And they did. I was speechless, which both Rand and Joey kind of chuckled over. But then I accepted it. I was ordained online by Claire James, who I'm so glad said yes to doing that. It was important to me to have a woman ordain me. And Claire has been a friend and a mentor. Those are some very important highlights of what's happened along my journey to this call to evangelist. And they were all needed to happen, and they were done on God's time, not mine. And I'm glad it was God's time, because if it would have been my time, I wouldn't have learned patience and waiting on the Spirit to move in the way it needed to move. So I hope that's a handy little highlight of chapter 2.
That is a wonderful, wonderful highlight of chapter 2. Sometimes in our life we can pause for a moment and look back, and different things can come to our mind. Is there anything that you wish you had known about chapter 2 when you were in the middle of living the pages of chapter 1?
Oh, yes. She laughs, you laugh. We all laugh together on this one. I wish I would have known that I could slow down and trust. I didn't know that in the process of chapter 1. And one of the things I've had to learn, well, it's the lyrics to one of the pieces, I think it's in Isaiah. The piece is called "O Rest in the Lord." "O rest in the Lord, wait patiently for him. He will give you your heart's desires." I think of everything I've needed to learn. I needed to learn before that call to evangelist came that it's more important to rest and to seek that type of guidance. If I would have known then what I know now, I also would have known that this process for some is very traumatic. The process for me required me to lay down a Bible, a Book of Mormon, and other things, and allow my soul to heal. I can see it now looking back, but I couldn't see it while I was in the middle of it. I couldn't understand how the Spirit was working to heal and to help me progress. And I had a lot of healing to do. I know that now. I finally came to understand it in 2023 after a very close call with death. I returned home from the hospital, set my bag down in the hallway, went into my living room, sat down on the sofa, and just sobbed. And the Spirit said, "Gail, you have some serious healing to do that you haven't done yet. It's time for you to do that work." This time I didn't question, I trusted. And at the end of 2023, I knew it was time to find the healer that would enable me to fully heal. I set out on adventure, a research project, and I trusted that I would be led to the right person. I think one of the things that faith crises and transitions can do is it can break down a person's complete understanding what they know. At least I think that's the way it is for a lot of LDS seekers. And you have to come to the realization that maybe you believe some things. You have to leave it all on the floor. You have to exercise some humility that you will be led by the Spirit. And I think when we do that, we're better able to journey into new places. no matter where they are, whether they are here or there. And it also allows us to open up new pathways and understanding about who God is in our lives and what God might want us to seek out for ourselves. If I had known that when I first started this, I might have been a little more patient, not fully, but a little more. If I had known that God had wanted me to really slow down and that all of this would happen in God's time. Well, I'm not sure that the journey would have been the same. So I'm glad for the unknown. I've learned to sit with it, to enjoy it, and even to revel in it. I like a good mystery, but I also like a mystery with some context.
I love that. You said a lot of really, really important things. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on before we let you go today. But I want to ask you, Gail, because, uh, as you say, we don't know the future. We travel into the unknown. And of course, you're starting chapter 1. You had no idea that at some point on your story in the not too distant future, you would be in the middle of a pandemic. So, how do you think living out faith in the midst of a global pandemic impacted chapter 2?
Oh boy, do I have a story for you. I'm a listener. And when the pandemic hit and Steve Easy announced we're going to have to shut it all down, I got some frantic calls from a few people. I won't mention where they were located. Let's say they were on this side of the pond. And this church start with the pandemic was that I knew how to cope with this. And after listening to the calls that I got, I sat with it for a minute. And then I thought, I know exactly what I do in this situation. Now, I should mention something here. I'm an Enneagram 8. And for those who know the Enneagram, you know that an unbalanced, not healthy 8 can fly up the handle. Well, I was working on my 8ness, and I didn't fly off the handle in the way that I would have in the past. And I contacted Joey. Well, I also spoke with Richard. I said, you can't do this way. This is not the way to handle this. But when I spoke to Joey, he says, I've got the solution for this. I told him what the solution was. And he says, Gail, I'll be back to you within the hour. That was a Saturday night. From that Saturday night, when I got the green light, I created a presentation. By Tuesday, that following week, and of course, this had to be green lighted in several areas. Obviously, Richard had to say yes to. I took everything we knew at Community Circle about running an online service, put it out there, and by Tuesday, we had people attending from Europe and the US. I think we even had Canada. I don't remember now. I just showed people how to run an online service. That was a groundwork. That was amazing. And the solution was clear to me. I was also ordained during the pandemic. I had hoped to be ordained in person, but that didn't happen. I am thankful that we pushed in 2019 for online sacraments. I was in that meeting at World Conference. And by this time, Art Smith knew who I was and knew what Circle was up to. And he looked over at me. He popped into that meeting and just kind of gave me a smile when I spoke to what needed to happen. This needed to happen. We needed online sacraments. Community Circle could not function fully without them. And as we move forward, it became essential to what we did as a community in Community Circle. And we moved forward with that. You know, we were an online community. We are an online community. And I am so thankful that the ability to put the sacraments online became present, because in Circle, we can't drive in a car to get to members. It's a Zoom call where we then do whatever sacrament is needed. And it made the pandemic a lot easier. The only thing that doesn't work on Zoom is singing, but we make it work. So for me, little change as far as congregation life, except that this was the time during which I attended Redlands University, which is connected with San Francisco Theological Seminary, and I certified as a spiritual director. They don't have many out-of-country people, but they do have some that decide to engage the program. And that for me happened during the pandemic. It was a delightful 2 years. Of course, every time we met, everybody joked me about the fact that I was staying up till 2 or 3 in the morning. How can you do that? But I just, well, that's what I've got to do. It was, I have no regrets about the limitations that were. So my experience with pandemic and church and other things was a lot better than those who had to adjust to not meeting as a congregation in person. Because for Community Circle, I just call it Circle, by the way, this was the norm for us.
That's a really great point. So you brought so many things into this reflection, one of which is we had a world conference in 2019, the spring, I believe, of 2019. And at that world conference, we had a lunch and learn with online ministries, and we had on record about 7 online ministries, and they were at different stages. Some had been around, a couple had been around for a while, but most were newer kind of ventures into cyberspace, so to speak. And And you were there talking about Circle at this lunch and learn. And we were in the Continence Room, which is a very large lecture room, and it was packed with folks, and we had translations and everything. And you could just feel the electricity in the air and the interest in that. And also during that World Conference, because this question had come up many times over the years for some of our pioneer online ministries, is we need to be able to share the sacrament of the Lord's Supper online. And that was a really big deal. And the theology formation team did a big review on this. And I remember, we had this huge report with all these different dimensions of things to consider that went to the first presidency. And during that World Conference, the presidency made it possible for us to share the sacrament of communion online. And looking back, and I still get tingles all over my body, the divine synchronicity that was resident in that response and that timing was amazing. And one of the things I remember the theology formation team talking about, because we kind of struggled with, where we were personally on this, even though we were doing our very, very best to just focus on the theological framing, the pro, the con, the caution, the green light kind of stuff. And I was in this camp of, well, we certainly could do the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, but man, I don't think we could do anything else. That we just really need to, you know, maybe someday we'll go there. But we're in the pandemic and we're like 1 week in, and it's like, well, of course you need to do all the sacraments online. And because it forced us into a space of human connection where we could see without a shadow of a doubt that the Spirit is not confined in any way, shape, or form at all. And the only sacrament with full immersion baptism is, that we had to be with the person that was receiving the sacrament was baptism. And man alive, did that ripen the body? And we'd had all this discussion about communion. So the body was ripe and open and receptive to, yes, roll it out. And the first presidency, I've got to just applaud them. They wasted no time in making provision for all the other sacraments to be offered online. And I'm sure you experienced this in your ordination to the office of elder. There was no denying the presence of the Holy Spirit in the midst of that. I mean, it was just the it just continues to floor me how powerful the Holy Spirit can be, and just the divine synchronicity. But I had not considered that you all might have been one of the few, perhaps the only, that only had an online connection congregation, because that's how you had originally connected with each other. That's how you built your relationships with one another, and you didn't really have a brick and mortar option for that. And so that transition, I had not considered that that transition would feel so natural. At the same time, you were so well equipped to like dial in to your apostle and mission center president and say, "Hey, we can do this. Just let's get it going." And you had it within a week. That's wonderful. So exciting. I love that part.
You know what? I've got a story for you.
Uh-huh.
So we get the green light from World Church for online communion. I'm not going to be able to tell this story, probably without crying. We have our first online communion at Circle. And one of the things that happened was that we sang for everyone born a place at the table. But instead of just singing it on mute, we left the mute off. And different congregants took a verse and sang that verse. And there was only one person missing from that service. And later in the week, it's either Wednesday or Thursday, I can't recall which day now, I got a message from Richard James. And he said, "Can you be online in 30 minutes? He'd gotten called from Michael. And Michael was going to be at home. And Richard wanted to make sure that Michael could experience as soon as possible what we had done that last Sunday." The Spirit was so strong in both situations. We couldn't have all rushed out into a brick and mortar, even if we'd had one. But we could take a break from what we were doing and gather on Zoom to create this process. And at the time, we didn't have that many priesthood people in circle. It was a powerful process. And I'm so glad First Presidency had the vision. And people at World Conference caught the vision of what things could be. Because that, for us, those who were a part of Circle at that time, it's something we won't forget.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us, Gail.
You've been listening to an episode in the Fair Trade series of Faith Unfiltered podcast. This is episode 1 of 2 in the second chapter of Gail Shurtleff's conversation and journey of faith. Be sure and join us next time for part 2 of this conversation.